Joshua 1:1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Now Joshua 1:1 starts with this word after. It causes us to ask the question, after what? And then it gives us the answer, after the death of Moses. And who was Moses? Well, Moses, according to this verse, we all know who Moses was, but Moses, according to this verse, was labeled as the servant of the Lord. He was a servant. He was a servant of the Lord. Anytime you see the Lord in all capital letters, Lord, you know this is the divine name. This is the great I am. This is Jehovah God, Yahweh, the divine name that God gave to Moses to give to the people of Israel while they were still in Egypt. And so after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, now he's speaking to Joshua once Moses has passed off the scene. But this causes us to ask the question, how long did God give Joshua and the people of Israel to mourn and weep for God's servant Moses? Was it a day, maybe two, maybe a week, maybe just 30 seconds? I mean, ultimately, we don't really know, but I think what we find out in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 8, is that God actually gave them a whole month, 30 days. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 8, and the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him. And so the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. You see, I believe that we see in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 8, that God gave them the courtesy of mourning and weeping and grieving for this servant leader, Moses, for 30 days. But eventually, they need to stand up. They need to step up, and they need to go forward into the land that God had called them to. And so now, after the death of Moses, God is speaking to Joshua. But I want you to notice how Moses is described. Moses is described as the servant. This tells us two things. Number one, that no one is irreplaceable. Moses was truly a great leader. Few people really could stand up against him or match his leadership ability. And yet, look at this. God is replacing Moses with Joshua. Shows us that no one is irreplaceable. Why? Because we're all servants. You can easily, if you have this as your perspective, that God is the master and we are all servants, well, God is able to replace a servant with another servant, because we're all temporary. Moses was no exception to this. And so no one is irreplaceable, not even Moses. Joshua was now replacing him in leadership. It also shows us, though, that no one was above being a servant, not even Moses. You see, we are servants. Moses was not a superstar. He was not a superhero. He was a servant, and he was a servant of the Lord. And this is the precedent that Moses was setting for his assistant Joshua. Be a servant of the Lord, of Yahweh. And so now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant. Now, who's Joshua? Because there's probably 2 million people in Israel at this time. And so certainly there would be other leaders that God could have chosen or called or commissioned or whatever. And so why Joshua? Well, if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 1 through 8, and even verse 14 here, you'll see that before Moses actually died, God had already commissioned Joshua to be the next leader of Israel. Moses was not going to enter the land, but Joshua was going to take the people into the land and possess it. And so God had already commissioned Joshua, and so Joshua knew this was coming. He may not have known exactly when God was going to speak to him, but he knew that God was going to speak to him and bring his commission to fruition. And so now God, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord is now speaking to Joshua. But who is this Joshua? This Joshua is the son of Nun. And this is not N-O-N-E, as if he had no parents. Nun is the name of his father. In 1 Chronicles chapter 7, verses 20 through 29, you see Joshua's lineage. And Nun, or Nun, or however you say it, is the name of his dad. And he was not only the son of Nun, but he was also Moses' assistant. And this was not something that had just happened. If you look all the way back in Exodus chapter 33, verse 11, that's 40 40 years before this verse right here even happened, before the death of Moses took place. 40 years before all of this, in Exodus chapter 33, verse 11, Joshua was labeled as Moses' assistant. And so immediately after they left Egypt, Joshua was already assisting Moses. And so these two were together forever during this time. Joshua was like a right-hand man for Moses, the servant leader. And so he would definitely see Moses as more than just a leader who passed away, but as a friend and a loved one and a godly man who poured into his life. And so God gave Joshua and the people of Israel 30 days to mourn and weep the loss of their loved one. But now it is time to move forward, and God is now commissioning Joshua for this task. He is the son of Nun, and he is Moses' assistant. He is to be a servant of the Lord Yahweh. This is Joshua 1:1.